You know, one of the reasons I did this design is how short the line is. I mean, the fuel line's just coming right here down into the pump, and then from the pump swooping down right up into the bottom of the unit. So overall, it's a really short run. Hey guys, Nomad Brad here. Today we're going to talk about Chinese diesel heater installation tips. So if you look at the instruction book that comes with your diesel heaters, it's hard to understand, and there's a lot of little tiny details that they actually didn't even describe in the installation manual. So through trial and error, I figured out kind of some of the big mistakes that if you know ahead of time, it can save you a headache. So in this video, I'm going to cover, let's see, I took notes so I can stay on track, but I have 12 tips that really are not mentioned in the instruction manual, and if you follow them, your diesel heater will perform excellent. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Tip number one is going to be the fuel pump. You want to have the fuel pump mounted at an angle, ideally between 15 and 30 degrees. So the pump looks like this. There'll be an arrow on it somewhere. On this one, the arrow is down here, so it's telling me that this is the output, so the fuel flows this way through the pump. And so the way you want to have it positioned is you want to have the output 15 to 30 degrees higher than the input. And so what that does is, the reason for this is that the piston pump creates air bubbles while it's working. And so if you have it up at an angle like this, as it's pumping, the air bubbles will rise to the top, and then the fuel is still able to trickle. If you have it just flush, then the air bubbles can actually restrict the flow of fuel and then cause operation issues. So tip number one, fuel pump, 30-degree angle with the output being higher than the input. Tip number two, this one's pretty important. Well, they're all important. This is the muffler. And so if you look at the muffler, it has on the bottom, it has what looks like a little bump. And so I hope you guys can see that in the video. I'm just using an iPhone, so if you can't see it, when you have your muffler, you can look at it and you'll easily see there's a bump on the edge of it. And if you look at it closely, it's actually a hole. So there's a hole right there. And what that is that's called a weep hole. And so it's actually an area for moisture to escape. So when you're mounting the muffler, you know, just looking at it, someone that has automotive background, you would think the muffler mounts like this, because this is how mufflers mount in cars. But this muffler on the heater, it mounts with this hole pointing down. And so again, what this hole does is it's allowing moisture to drip out. So as the diesel exits through the muffler, it'll have some condensation in the gas, and so it'll just drip out this hole. So very important, the muffler hole facing down. Again, if the hole is not facing down, it can cause moisture to back up inside your exhaust and cause problems. And then number three tip is the exhaust pipe. You want to make sure that the lowest point in your exhaust system is the muffler, okay? So I'll show you guys what I mean. If this is my exhaust system, then I want to make sure there's no low spots in the exhaust pipe before the muffler. For example, if I had the exhaust pipe installed like this, you can see down here at the bend, it's lower. And so that will cause moisture to accumulate down in this pipe, and then it can ultimately restrict exhaust, which can cause error codes. So you want to make sure, no matter what, the exhaust is the lowest point, and so your muffler will end up likely being tipped down at a little bit of an angle. So again, most of the trouble with this diesel heater, all the error codes, all the headaches people have, most of them are related to moisture issues within the system somewhere. So exhaust pipe, muffler needs to be the lowest point. Okay, now we're going to talk about the fuel line. So this is, whichever heater you buy will come with one of these two fuel lines. You can try to look at the pictures and see which is which. This is a hard nylon tube. This is kind of a soft, like a silicone tube. The hard nylon tube is better. The reason why is that the way this pump works, the fuel pump is a piston pump, and so it kind of goes like this, and it creates a pressure in the fuel line. And so the hard nylon pipe is actually, or the hard nylon line actually resists expanding and contracting from that pump operation. So it gives you a smooth fuel delivery without the chance of restricting the fuel line or creating additional bubbles in the line. So the hard nylon is better. The soft stuff, you can still use it, it's just not as good, but you just want to be very careful that when you make your connections that you don't pinch it, and when you're routing the pipe, it doesn't get pinched. And then going along with that, make sure you don't use your own fuel line. Don't go buy fuel line from Napa, don't go buy a fuel line that looks similar. That stuff is very specific for these heaters, so use the line that's included. Tip number 5, the fuel filter, you want to make sure you mount it in line with the fuel system before the pump. So if this is my fuel pump, it's got an arrow pointing this way, so this is the output. That means this is the input. So you want to make sure the fuel filter is in line before the pump. So it's kind of a simple one, but fuel filter first, then pump. Tip number 6 is going to be the direction of the flow within the fuel filter. So this fuel filter, also like the pump, has a specific direction of flow. So, you know, when I first looked at it, I just assumed it would come into this end and then the fuel would move into this basket, and then from the basket it would move out to the unit, but that's backwards. This is the way that it flows. It comes in to the big empty space where the fuel basket is at, and then it leaves out the smaller end. So for me, it was kind of backwards of what I thought made sense. So the direction of the fuel filter is important, and it will not tell you on the filter anywhere, which is the most frustrating thing about all these components, is they could easily just tell you or have an arrow. There's no indication. So the way that it works is the fuel comes in to the big empty part, and then it leaves through the filter basket, which is inside, which you might not see it in the video, but you can see it on your version. Tip number 7. This is our intake line. We want to make sure that the intake line, now keep in mind this is going to be outside the vehicle. You're going to drill a hole through the floor. This is coming out. You want to try to point the intake away towards the back of the vehicle. So the idea is when you're driving, you know, there's a potential for water and dirt and mud and leaves to kind of fly up at the unit. And so if you have it facing forward, then there's more of a chance that that stuff will be pushed into the intake. But if you have it facing backwards, then as you're driving, the air should just move right over the top of the filter. So, and that goes the same with having it be sideways. You want to try to not have it sideways, you know, underneath the van, because the stuff can come right into the side and clog the intake vent. So try to have the intake facing against the rear of the vehicle. Tip number 8, this is the base plate that installs on top of that installs underneath the heater. So it'll go like this, and it's designed that the heater sits right up against the base plate, and then the base plate sits right against the ground. You just want to be cautious about what you're mounting it to. If you're mounting this directly to the floor of your metal van, then you're probably fine. But if you're mounting against carpet or against a piece of plywood, like if you're mounting inside of a cabinet, then you should have an additional air gap or some type of a space between this base plate and the ground, because this base plate can transfer heat, and you don't want to cause any additional heat if it's against a combustible surface like wood. Tip number 9 is going to be adding a standpipe to your fuel tank. So for me, I used the included fuel tank, and I think a lot of you guys probably will as well. And so it comes with a kit, tap into the bottom. And so what you want to do is add a little piece of fuel line on the inside of the tank that sticks up about 1 inch. And so that way you're not pulling the very last bit of diesel out of the bottom, because in the bottom is where you're going to collect any sediment, any debris. And if you end up sucking that into your fuel line, it can clog up the fuel line itself. So you want to be pulling diesel just a little bit off the bottom. So building a standpipe inside the tank, that's the next tip. Tip number 10. Tip number 10 is going to be to prime the pump before you start the heater. So after you install your tank, you install all your components, your fuel pump, your heater, you're going to have a line of fuel hose going between each of those components. And what you want to do is you want to make sure you bring the fuel as close as you can to the heater before you turn it on. The reason why is this small fuel pump uses a piston to push the fuel, and the only thing that's lubricating the piston is the diesel fuel itself. So if you and the amount of fuel that it moves with each click. Once I turn it on, you'll see it's a tiny amount. I mean, this moves like a couple millimeters of fuel at a time. So if you had, you know, say 3 feet of hose, and you're gonna turn this on and try to just have the pump pull, you know, suck 3 feet of hose that's empty, then it can potentially damage the pump before you even start using the heater. So it's important to pull the gas all the way to the pump before you get started. Tip number 11, make sure you direct the exhaust away from the vehicle. So again, this is gonna be mounted underneath your vehicle, but it's important to make sure that the exhaust is pointing out, it's pointing outside. So what you don't want to do is just have this running midway underneath your vehicle and then it's exhausting combustion gas underneath the floor of your vehicle, because then there's a potential that, you know, this gas is you know, potentially poisonous, potentially deadly if there's carbon monoxide in it. You don't want to be breathing that. You don't want there to be any chance for this to make its way up inside your vehicle. So you want to make sure the exhaust is pointed out underneath your vehicle, not up underneath it. And tip number 12, install a carbon monoxide detector. Now, in general, the diesel heaters are very safe. Typical combustion does not include carbon monoxide, but if something happens to the air intake or the exhaust, improper combustion can result in the production of carbon monoxide, and that's the deadly killer. So there's always a potential something could happen and cause this unit to expel carbon monoxide, and if that's the case, you want to have a meter so you're alerted to it, and as soon as the meter goes off, you want to turn off the heater. So especially if you're going to be sleeping over the night with this unit running, which I do all the time, you're going to want to make sure, for peace of mind and for your safety, install a carbon monoxide detector. So that's the 12 tips. 12 tips they didn't tell you about in the instruction manual for installing the diesel heater safely.